Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by Stephen Erikson as we have another critical conversation of an author and a critic in conversation about something the author wrote. Hello, Steve.
We're going to be critical, are we? Okay.
Well, a bit. Um, Critical in the sense of applying critical reasoning.
Oh, that
Um,
stuff. Okay.
But I thought we could have a chat today about Beak, one of the characters from Reaper's Gale. He's a fan favorite. By the way, for anyone watching, this is going to have spoilers for Reaper's Gale, so
Yeah.
bye if you haven't read that. But Beak's journey and Beak's storyline is something that you bring into Reaper's Gale. He isn't in the previous books, and it is a very, very powerful storyline that a lot of readers identify with. A lot of readers really enjoy and get a huge emotional impact from. And I thought we could have a bit of a chat about it.
Sure. Sure. I mean, one of the things when I'm first it may even have been for gaming, when I was running the crew that ended up being the players were Bottle, Smiles, Cork, Tar. And so they were a squad in the Bone Hunters, but for the game purposes, I need to actually come up with all the other squads. And so I create lists, and I assign certain names to be sergeants, certain names to be corporals, and then all the various other roles. And sometimes I jumble them around. So if the name sounds better as a sergeant or as a corporal, I'll switch and move them all over the place. So that's where the list comes from. And so that list sort of stays there with me as I'm writing the books. And in the game, yeah, the crew, the squad, the players, they probably wouldn't meet these people at all. And they may never even get their names. But because the list is there, then when it's time to actually write about other squads other than fiddlers, um, I can just sort of look at them and pluck them out and see who they are, basically. And that's certainly what happened with Beak. I mean, he was on the list, and I had him allotted as a mage of some form or another. And then I needed a character, and so I pulled him out of the squads, and things sort of proceed from there. But what's interesting for me is that I'm not entirely sure of who the character is until I start writing that character. And then because I'm tied into the point of view, um, that character acquires a voice, usually very quickly, and then I run with it.
Because I think one of the interesting things is if to do a quick contrast with Gardens of the Moon. In Gardens of the Moon, you very much held back from giving backstory, from that sort of in-depth, well, not necessarily even in-depth, but a detailed character info dump, to use the negative and the pejorative for it.
Mhm.
But you held back from giving a lot of the background details because it was all about trying to pick up on who the character was in media res, in through that sort of covert and extrapolating from other character actions, always looking at them externally. And yet here with Beak, it's a new character that's introduced, and it's almost like the more traditional way of introducing a character, giving details about their backstory, filling in that traditional narrative arc of a character that you didn't do in Gardens of the Moon.
Yeah, well, Beak's backstory, what I found almost immediately was his internal narrative, and his internal story, the story he tells himself about himself, um, has no filters. But also it's all kind of leveled, so that what I found very quickly was that I could throw in certain details that would sort of send a shudder through the reader, but Beak is entirely unaware of what is actually being expressed here and what is being laid out for the reader. So we're seeing his internal landscape, but we're seeing it with a much clearer eye than he does. And so that sort of became then an exercise in characterization by a naive narrator. And that was his internal view. And of course, the sentence structure changes because of that. And he has run-on thoughts, and a lot of the obvious linkages between his thoughts are just removed. And so it just seamlessly flows from one to the next, which kind of, I would assume, jars the reader. That's the idea anyways, is that it's kind of all over the place in there. None of the normal constraints of narrative are operating for Beak. And so that way you can expose aspects about him that should hopefully startle the reader in some fashion.
But you don't go full stream of consciousness. Like it's still very much.
It's close, yeah.
But because I was thinking, like, do you remember Ian M. Banks' Fearsome Engine? And obviously, one of those character points of view is in an idiomatic dialect, stream of consciousness, very, very fractured and different from the rest of the narratives. So you don't go that full. It's written in italics, or there's no punctuation at all. It doesn't go that far, but there is that element of it creeping in, which sets tonally and structurally, and in terms of the style of the prose, sets it apart from the other POVs that you tie into.
Yeah, and that contrast is important because it's the characters around him and their responses to the things he says that is a kind of guidepost for the reader. But from the writer's point of view, I have to stay with Beak. And so, you kind of have to do that mental switch where Beak is observing the reactions of characters around him and not really able to figure out why they are reacting that way. And so one is juggling those two things. I mean, he can't be a character to the point where he is unaware of that people are responding in unusual ways to the things he says. He's just unable to answer why that's the case. But it's not that he's incapable of noticing these things. So he does have a kind of a social radar, but it's not the normal kind.
So Beak gets introduced in chapter 13. That's his first POV, but we're going to go to a little bit just before then, where he is basically first mentioned.
It's still in chapter 13 though, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just a couple of paragraphs before.
Yeah. And this is interesting because this is one case where a character is introduced before they're introduced, and they're introduced by their context. So they're introduced by characters around them talking about this character, but we've not met this character yet. But as soon as you look at it, at least when I look at it, boy, it sets the stage for Beak. It really does. So I guess somewhere in my mind, I was already assembling who this character was going to be.
Okay. So let me put this up on screen then.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have this is Fist Keneb talking to Fered and Sort.
Yeah.
And Keneb asks, "Oh, Captain, have you selected out the mage you want?" Fered and Sort's eyes narrowed briefly, and in the colourless light, the planes of her hard face looked more angular than ever. She sighed and said, "I believe so, Fist. From Sergeant Gripe's squad. Beak." "Him, are you sure?" She shrugged. "Nobody likes him, so you'll not rue the loss." Keneb felt a flicker of irritation. In a low tone, he said, "Your task is not meant to be a suicide mission, Captain. I am not entirely convinced this sorceress communication system is going to work. And once the squad start losing mages, it will all fall apart. You'll probably become the only link among all the units." "Once we find some horses," she cut in. "Correct." He watched as she studied him for a long moment. Then she said, Beak has tracking skills, Fist, of a sort. He says he can smell magic, which will help in finding our soldiers. So that's
Yeah.
just the section where he is basically first mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah. And even Sergeant Gripe, I don't think he's mentioned ever, which is a shame because it's such a great name. I wish I'd gone to Sergeant Gripe a few times. I love that name. Yeah, but so in a sense, so much of what I wrote was kind of first draft, and I would make minor changes here and there for grammar purposes and things like that. So what you're kind of seeing here is the assemblage of a character on the page that I haven't got to yet. And so I'm building it as I go. And yeah, it's quite dismissive, isn't it? It's I mean, it's pretty cold of Fered and Sword to say you'll not rue the loss, because nobody likes him. And then in a sense, I guess that sets me up to change her mind once we follow the story through and we stay and we're with Beak. And so probably in my own mind, I think by setting him up this way, I already had sympathy for him, and that was going to be very important.
Well, you see, it's interesting you say that because that's not quite how I read the exchange. Because we know that Fered and Sort likes to come across as a real hard ass. That
Yeah.
she likes to come across as very cold and calculating and powerful and takes no nonsense. But it's clear that Beak not being liked is not the reason she is choosing Beak. It's he can smell magic. When things go wrong, if things go wrong, he has an ability that will be useful. And she doesn't want to admit that. She has to come across cold first. And that's how I interpreted that exchange. But it still puts in, the line that Beak is in some way isolated, that he isn't particularly well liked. But let's face it, most of the mages aren't well liked.
No, they
one
aren't,
likes
are
the
they?
mage.
No, they aren't. But also, it's not that he can smell magic. She says he can smell magic. So she's not entirely convinced, and even at this point. But I mean, yeah, your interpretation is fine. I don't, I'm having to try to remember back on these things, and it certainly sets things up for Fered, Sort, and Beak to have some kind of relationship in the story to come.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that initial exchange, because while Beak's storyline, it is almost like this self-contained, embedded narrative. So much of it depends because it is Beak and Fered and Sort for most of it.
Yeah.
Either Beak's memories and his thoughts, or his exchanges with Fered and Sort. There is that play on the two, and it's interesting to get because we know Fered and Sort, so it's interesting to get her perspective first, which creates this image in our heads before we get Beak being introduced just a couple of paragraphs later and seeing his perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's an accident that I chose Fered and Sort for this, because she's already the one who has stomped on the scorpions, right? So the reader is not particularly enraptured with Fered and Sort anyways, which raises the issue of when she makes pronouncements and statements, the reader's not immediately jumping along side with those statements and those positions. So in other words, her evaluation, her judgments are not the readers, right? So basically, when she's saying that that this is a weird character that nobody likes, who may have the skills that are required, it's different if, say, I chose, instead of Fered and Sort, I chose Fiddler. Think of how that would be completely different, right? First of all, Fiddler probably wouldn't have said those things, but it would have set things up differently. And so even the point of view that we get here of Fered and Sort, she's not somebody we know her. We don't know her particularly super well. And even though we know her, we may not like her, right? So there is that aspect of her, which then sort of kicks back onto, well, if since we don't like Fered and Sort, chances are we're going to like Beak. You know what I mean? You know what I mean?
But
Yeah,
you see, playing on that,
yeah,
because of the narrative arc with Beak's sacrifice at the end, and how his relationship with Fered and Sort changes, because you've initially paired him up with someone who is cold, is calculating, is unlikable and unliked, that seeing her change
hmm
is mirroring the reader's experience about this, and it means then that in some respects Beak's sacrifice actually gains more impact, because even someone as cold and as callous as Fered and Sort, because she is affected by it, that actually elevates the level of sacrifice and the emotional importance.
yeah. She's kind of a stand-in for the most reluctant reader, right, in terms of emotional engagement. So yeah, and that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay,
But then
so
we switch to his point of view just a few paragraphs later, don't we?
yeah, so let
First
me
time.
bring that up.
Yeah. So that's the opening line. Beak didn't know much about any of this. Um, in a way, if one were to write a short story about a character, I mean, that's a great opening line just for a short story. Um, although the idea of this is what was preceding this section, the conversation between Kenneth and Fered and Sort about using magic to communicate between all the squads. So that's not in there, but just as an opening line, yeah, it establishes very quickly that this is not a character who is in the know, the way that Fered and Sort and Kenneth are. So somebody's brought this to him. Sergeant Gripe presumably said, you're going over there, get over there, and he just went.
Mm-hmm. But it's interesting because Beak didn't know much about any of this. You don't actually need to know, although
Yeah.
you have that causal link because it is the section immediately following.
Yeah.
You have that link, and the reader can track that, and that's one of the nice things, one of the nice transitions, that you're implying that's what Beak is talking about. But this actually works with almost anything, and then you feed into the reader just to reassure them. He would be the first to admit he didn't know much about anything at all, except maybe weaving sorcery. And we slowly, as he goes down through these paragraphs, you realize that yes, he is talking about that previous thing, even if you had missed that this is the transition, that little gap in scene change.
Mm,
It's still linking the two, and it's one of those transitions we see in cinema all the time.
yeah.
But what is interesting here is the one thing he knew for certain, however, was that no one liked him.
Mm-hmm.
And as we've said, mages in the series are not traditionally well liked. They tend to be outsiders, even within their own groups.
Yeah.
Something messing with the primordial forces of nature must do that to people.
I would think so. Yes.
But where this could have come across as self, not self-aggrandizing, where he's sort of painting himself as victim. We don't get that sense, even from this
No.
little tiny snippet, that this is about him playing a victim. You get a sense that he is being honest because he doesn't know much about anything except, well, people don't like him. That's about the only thing he knows. You get a sense of that's what he's actually talking about.
Yeah, there's an element of veracity to that kind of statement. I mean, there's not many people who are just sort of will blankly admit that nobody likes them, unless they've got other reasons for saying so. But there's no indication that there's any other reason. It's basically a declarative statement,
Mm.
which he can't explain, right? Because he doesn't know much about anything at all.
And it's this next paragraph is one that I think sets up a lot of Beak's story. And
Yeah.
so I'll just read through it here. So getting tied to the belt of this scary captain woman would probably turn out to be a bad idea. She reminded him of his mother, looks-wise, which should have killed quick any thoughts of the lustful kind. Should have, but didn't, which he found a little disturbing if he thought about it, which he didn't much. Unlike his mother, anyway, she wasn't the type to browbeat him at every turn, and that was refreshing.
Yeah.
And there's so much going on in
Yeah.
this paragraph. So
Yeah, what one would hope the reader's alarm bells start ringing at this point, right? Yeah.
but why don't I point out a couple of things that I initially would talk about with this, and then I'll bounce that off you, and then you can talk about some stuff. So this phrase, getting tied to the belt of the scary captain woman, is if we think tied to the apron strings would be the more traditional phrasing. So that is immediately the connotative point of connection that we have here. But and it's been changed obviously for the military milieu in which we find ourselves. But it's scary captain woman, and it's such an innocent way, a naive way of trying to describe Fered and Sort. This is not elevated, complex adult language. This is very much the language of a child, the compounding of these terms. And then she reminded him of his mother, looks-wise.
Yeah, well, stop even before you get to the looks wise. We've got scary woman reminded him of his mother, right? Those are the ones where you know the writer is basically trying to convey a lot more than what's just there on the page.
Yes. Well,
and-
Stephen.
Yeah, well, yeah. No, I mean, one is making links. Hopefully, for the reader is making links that are not stated straight out. So that it's I don't know, subtextual.
Yep.
Dare I use the word?
And the thing is, you jumped in there before I was going to point out this thing, which is she reminded him of his mother, looks-wise. But it's this comma that is actually really, really important here.
Yes, it is.
Because that is framing this as a kind of secondary thought after the primary thought. So that's where we get linking the scary captain woman to his mother. And then this comma breaks up the notion, because if you remove the comma, she reminded him of his mother looks-wise.
Yeah.
Would have worked. But what we have is the clause, she reminded him of his mother, and then almost a rationalization or a qualification immediately following it, as if to try to explain away, oh, this scary woman, she reminds me of my mother. Oh, I mean by how she looks.
Mm.
And that's why, for me, this comma is so important, which I think goes to the point that you jumped in with, interrupting me as I was about to make it.
Yeah. Well, that's my job, isn't it?
And what then follows is, which should have killed quick any thoughts of the lustful kind. And of course, the big operative word there is should, which obviously implies that it hasn't. And then it is then repeated. And in case you missed it, it is then followed up, but didn't. And I just love this repetition. I love this echoing of, you can imagine this thought. This is so tied into how someone is thinking, and how you have that bubbling and the sequence of thoughts happening so quickly that are all echoes and building on each other before moving on to the next sort of semi-complete thought. That this is a wonderful way to get that interiority.
Yeah. If you imagine it as a small geared wheel, at this point it's slipping, right? It's slipping and it's slipping and it's slipping. Yeah.
And then it moves on to this should have but didn't, which he found a little disturbing if he thought about it. And then followed up by which he didn't. Full stop. Much. Full stop. Unlike his mother. And because, again, it is broken up with that comma, this this is what I find, the use of punctuation here, which is such a nerdy subject to be talking about,
Yeah.
but the use of punctuation to show how all of these clauses are actually um, commenting on the previous bit, but also leading into the next bit, and it's this jumbling of the thoughts and showing the interconnectivity. So
Yeah, and you know, it's funny because it just sort of it exploded onto the page. It just came out that this was going to be kind of a internal on rushing monologue um, that I wasn't going to mess with. I was just going to let it run and see where it took us. Um, and so, you know, structure wise, a lot of the sentences are either run on or they're fragments or, you know, but they're all, yeah, there's a lot of spinning wheels, in this stuff, kicking up a lot of dirt, basically.
because just to finish off then the point that I wanted to make about this paragraph. So he starts off, he's trying to talk about Fered and Sort. He's thinking about this mission he's going on with Fered and Sort, this captain. And his thoughts immediately turn to his mother.
Yeah.
I'm going on a mission with this captain, and she looks a bit like my mother, and I have sexual thoughts. Not about my mother, no. And this sort of confusion, and when it says, which he found a little bit disturbing, if he thought about it, which he didn't much, unlike his mother. So the implication is he thinks about his mother all the time.
Yep.
And that's what we've just seen in the paragraph. So the use of the punctuation, the use of these little fragments is consolidating the fact that he has some sort of Oedipal complex of a kind, which is what's being suggested.
Mm.
And then we find out with the last sentence, which I think is actually quite important. She wasn't the type to browbeat him at every turn. And there's an ambiguity whether this was an aspect his mother didn't browbeat him, therefore implying someone else did. He's then mapping that onto Fered and Sort as a comment about Fered and Sort, that she's not going to browbeat him. And so there's this whole complexity of that language, of his thoughts, that is actually so revealing about his character and sets the foundation stones for what we find out about later.
Yeah. And then the paragraph ends on the word refreshing. Yeah, which is just like, what? Where did that come from, right? So,
Um, and then we get his, what he thinks, how he introduces himself to people. I was born a stupid boy to very rich, noble-born parents. Usually the first words he uttered to everyone he met. The next ones were, that's why I became a soldier, so as I could be with my own kind. Conversations usually died away shortly after that, which made Beak sad. And again, which made Beak sad, we get this naive, childish, immature style of language, style of expression. Certainly an element of inability to talk about emotions in any sort of complex way. It made him sad, not distressed or upset. It very simple style of language. And that then puts, if you think of what he usually says as an introduction, I was born a stupid boy to very noble, very rich, noble-born parents. That's why I became a soldier, so as I could be with my own kind. The nice contraction here of so's. But if that is how he introduces himself, you think this is so socially awkward. This is so strange. This is so outside of the norm. And yet this is apparently what he says to people.
Yeah, he's got his mantra. Yeah, and of course he's completely unaware he's insulted his company, right? So, and that's why the conversations die away.
And I think it's because he doesn't realize that it's the use of the word, I was born stupid and I became a soldier to be with my own kind.
Which is clearly not what he meant, but at the same time, there it is.
And we'll just look at this this last sort of, let's see, yeah, these last two paragraphs here, just
Yeah.
of looking
Yeah.
specifically at the language. So just let me read through this paragraph, because I think there are three major points here that I think are really important about this particular paragraph. So it's, he would have liked to talk with the other squad mages, but even there it seemed he couldn't quite get across his deep in the bone love of magic. So just pausing here for a second, this is, he's trying to express how much magic means to him, how important magic is to him. And then now we're going to get what he actually says, because he's recalling this. Mystery, he'd say, nodding and nodding. Mystery, right? And poetry. That's sorcery. Mystery and poetry. And you have this beautiful moment, just to pause there, this beautiful moment where he's talking about how much he loves this art, this power, what magic is. And it is a really beautiful, emotional, caring, and very positive aspect. And then what
Yeah, yeah,
follows?
he's very excited, isn't he? And so that's how the sentence structure it plays itself out, to indicate how excited and breathless almost he is.
And we have that with his deep in the bone love of magic. This is a passion of an artist who loves art, who loves painting, who loves sculpture, who loves literature. This is that passion that you try to explain to other people what it means to you, this overwhelming joy and appreciation for this thing. And it's a really beautiful and powerful moment. And
Well, okay, just let's stay with that for a second, because this is an example for, I think, for writers, where you can use the point of view tied in with sentence structure and rhythm, to convey the emotional context that's not necessarily there, not explicitly anyways. So to use nodding and nodding is kind of the key to this in setting up that rhythm, because it indicates, I mean, you can picture that, right? It's not just, if it were a single nod, it wouldn't work nearly as well, right? It has to be nodding and nodding, which sounds kind of crazy. It doesn't, I mean, it doesn't really make sense, but it makes sense to match his excitement in this moment. So it's one can picture that, I think, even though it doesn't make sense.
well, it's the enthusiastic bobbing
Yeah.
of the head over and over again because you're so excited about something. And then there's the little fragments, mystery, right, and poetry. That's sorcery, mystery and poetry. You can see this bubbling, this passion, this enthusiasm all coming across. And then we get to this moment where Beak says something that he clearly has absolutely normalized, rationalized, doesn't
Yeah.
think is out of the ordinary in any way. And it gives us great insight into him and is a devastating emotional trauma on that you show the reader, and you show how oblivious Beak is to it, whether it's been rationalized or whether he just doesn't understand it, which is what my mother used to say to my brother when she crawled into his bed on the nights father was somewhere else. And in that juxtaposition, that contrast between his pure unadulterated joy of celebrating his passion for magic, and then unthinkingly, without any sort of thought behind it, revealing this terrible aspect of his past that we as a reader, that his listeners in the diegetic reality would be aware of, that his mother abused his brother.
Yeah, and I think part of this is hopefully the reader realizes, even subconsciously, that when he talks about, earlier on, the conversations he has with others that quickly die off, which makes him sad. This is part of the reason for why these conversations disappear the way they do. So he's, so in other words, there is an audience that's implicit in this paragraph about the other squad mages who are listening to the very same things that the reader is now reading. And so the reader then will have a similar response to what that, like you say, the diegetic audience would have had. And it's kind of, it's weird because he's kind of doing, this is all exposition, right? This is all even though he quotes in places, it's taken out of its proper time. So this is still internal monologue, even though he's making these quotes. But it's an instance where I'm actually structurally showing, but doing a whole, or actually structurally telling, but doing a whole lot of showing. Does that make sense?
Kind of. It's
Yeah.
I think people get very bent out of shape about show don't tell.
I know.
But and there's a lot going on, and I think we're all familiar with. There's an expression my dad would use, which is now we're sucking diesel, which because he was a country boy. And I'd say, so if I use that expression, now we're sucking diesel, as my dad used to say, because he was a country boy, that's the sort of the phrasing and approach that Beak has here, except it's mystery and poetry, because he's talking about magic. Where does he know that phrase? Well, that's what my mother used to say when she crawled into bed with my brother.
Yeah.
And he says it with that same, this apparently is perfectly normal behavior, because that's how he understands it, but his fixation on it suggests that even unconsciously there is he realizes that this is not normal. He just has no way to process it. And
Yeah.
it is this insight into Beak as a character. Remember, we're so shallow into how far down into Beak's story we've gone, and we're already getting all of this depth about who he is and what he is and how he thinks and what has gone on with his backstory. And
yeah, it's 4 paragraphs. It's the 5th paragraph on his character. It also, I think I probably realized at this point when I wrote that paragraph that I am foreshadowing the ultimate fate of Beak's family, because I tied it so closely into the magic. But and that's something that would have, I would have looked back on and thought, okay, yeah, this is where I'm giving a hint of where this is all going.
Yeah. And then we find out not only was the mother sexually abusive, but it's couched in these very loving terms.
Yeah.
We're living in mystery and poetry, my dear one, she'd say. So this is what he thinks, or this is what he is saying that he thinks love is. And this is his only way to express what he feels about magic, mystery, and poetry. And then he said, I'd pretend I was asleep, since once I sat up and she beat me real bad. And now we know his mother was physically abusive as well as sexually abusive. And then normally she never did that, with her fists, I mean. And there's just so much tragedy and trauma here that he is casually revealing. And then most of my tutors did that so she wouldn't have to. So she would order people to beat him. But I sat up and that made her mad. And potentially then the reader's interpreting this as she thought that he was asleep while she was doing, she was abusing his brother. And now there was a witness. So she beat the witness, i.e. Beak. The house healer said I almost died that night. And that's how I learned about poetry. And so the points here about his love of magic, this abuse that he and his brother suffered, this trauma that he suffered, and the physical abuse that almost killed him, all tied up in this paragraph. And this is what he relays to other people without thought, without thinking it's strange to tell people this. He has no shame about any of this. He's not burdened by that guilt or shame that abuse survivors so frequently feel, because they feel bad about what was done to them, instead of realizing that this is all the abuser's fault. They take that as an additional burden on themselves. And here we have Beak being absolutely free of this, and not almost not realizing that really this has had a tremendous impact on his psyche.
Yeah, I mean, I think you and Philip debated whether Beak was brain damaged versus psychologically damaged, as sort of the dominant features of his personality. I don't even think I have an answer to that. But I think what I was sort of coming to at this point was recognizing just how important the lit candle was going to be for Beak. And for whatever reason, my instincts were right that I invented a brother rather than have the mother come into Beak's bed. And I think that that's a distinction that paid dividends in terms of a storyline, which sounds cold and clinical, but I think it's more powerful, and it gave me more to a backstory than I could have had if it had just been Beak. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and again, I mean, it goes into the use of sexual abuse as a motivating factor for a character. We've had this discussion,
Yeah.
and when it is used unthinkingly, we talk about the trope of fridging, but when it is used unthinkingly of a female love interest being raped or sexually abused to motivate the hero, that is an unthinking use of the trope to provide the hero character, the male character, with a motivation. Here we're seeing a variant of it in that the sexual abuse happened to someone that Beak loved, his brother, a fraternal love, and he suffered physical abuse. So again, we're seeing abuse being used as shaping a character, which makes sense. Abuse and damage and trauma shape us. They leave us with scars, and that makes us the people that we are. In addition to like happy memories and happy events shape us and make us the people that we are as well. But this is one of those aspects. And I think it's important here because when Beak sacrifices his life to save everyone else, he is fulfilling what he tried to do to save his brother. Where he couldn't save his brother, he now can save everyone else. That is all being tied up here in Beak's love for other people and his love of magic, that this is being tied together very neatly in these paragraphs.
Also the sense that, as we're going to find out a little bit, was that the one time that Beak used all his candles beforehand was for death and destruction. And so he that adds to his determination that the next time he uses it, it's for the opposite. Because he finds a family actually that in his mind accepts him, which he never had.
So. Yeah. And as to the point that when Philip and I had talked about this, about whether he was on the autistic spectrum, whether he was suffering from PTSD or an aspect of psychological trauma from his abuse, or whether he was brain damaged, it's almost secondary. Not that it is irrelevant. It's almost secondary which of those is primary. It could be any combination of all three of them. It could be anything.
Yeah.
But what we're learning about here is Beak has a traumatic past, and it gives him a unique perspective. And what we see in his transition is not him being shamed or minimized or ridiculed for being a survivor. Not that his trauma is the only thing about him, but we see that it is part and parcel of who he becomes and what makes his sacrifice even more powerful and to have an even greater resonance. So I like that.
The candles are Beak's survival mechanism, and they are the survival mechanism of everything that we're seeing being laid out here in his backstory. And so it only makes sense, at least thematically and in character development, in the sense of character development, that he extend the survival mechanism to all the ones around him, even at the expense of his own life, which is how it sort of ends up. So yeah, I guess all these things sort of have to interweave with each other in order to sort of, I guess in my mind, make sense as a character is being written out and developed.
Yeah. So just in the next paragraph, there's only three sentences that I wanted to pick up on, which
Sure.
is sometimes a mage would just up and hug him, then walk away. Once a wizard he was talking to just started crying. That had frightened Beak. And we see here that, you know, he tells people these things, and he doesn't understand why they are doing this. And clearly they are traumatized for him. They are upset for him, and they don't know how to deal with it because he doesn't seem upset by it. And they can't work out what they're doing, and they can't deal with that level of emotional truth being revealed to them. So we see that they give him a hug in solidarity. It's not that they don't like him. They do like him. They feel bad for him. They just don't understand how to treat him.
Yeah.
So we get a sense that Beak has misunderstood, and everyone has misunderstood Beak's relationship with the others. But if we scroll down a little bit further here, this is where we get this point about the candle, and I think this is the central image with Beak. That is so important. We had a city witch in charge of the stables in the country estate. She said that for me, sorcery was the lone candle in the darkness. The lone candle in the darkness. She said my brain had put out all the other candles, so this one would shine brighter and brighter. So she showed me magic, first the Seti way, which she knew best, but later she always found other servants, other people who knew other kinds, warrens, that's what they're called, different coloured candles for each and every one of them. And he assigns colours to them. And this idea of all of this darkness, we see that this is the darkness of his past, his trauma, his life, and this beautiful shining love is a candle, is a light in this. And because it's absolute darkness, he's unaware of it. And we see this focus on this pure love he has for what magic is, and he has an understanding of magic unlike anyone else's. This is a personal affinity and not a studied reaction like Taishrin, who is the scholar, the arcane scholar. This is a person so in tune with it that they feel it on a fundamental level.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of character development, the precedent has already been set that Beak attaches himself to certain short phrases that have been told to him, which then have become sort of central to his being. The first one was what was a mystery in poetry.
Yeah.
And now here we've got the lone candle in the darkness, which he then repeats, because these are the things that are the elements constructing his entire internal landscape. And they're simple and straightforward, but they're also very abstract. But he's got very specific visualizations for them. So in other words, he's very much taking metaphors and making them real in his head and personifying them in some fashion or another. In this case, candles. I mean, very simple, very straightforward. And then he gives them colors. So it's quite a childlike sort of assemblage of the things that are important, you know, on the floor in your bedroom. You know, you gather up your toys and you assemble them. You lay them out on the floor and you've got them all. And that's kind of his how he basically builds up everything inside, and has no compunction about delivering the details of that. There's no filters at all. There's no constraints to Beak, which of course is then completely shown to be absolutely true by his concluding scenes with the squads.
Yeah. And there's a really nice just exchange at the very end where we realize he's actually speaking to Fered and Sword.
Yeah.
And she asks, "You know how to use Makra?" And his immediate response is, "Yes. Want me to show you?" And he's so eager to please. He's so eager to help. He's so eager to show people this beautiful love of magic and show people magic that it's just, it is heartbreaking. As much as Beak's entire storyline is heartbreaking, we see it all from the very beginning in this introduction. And that is the thing that I wanted to show in these just opening paragraphs.
Mm. Yeah, it's odd when characters just sort of take shape in front of the writer, and it's just a case then of trusting one's instincts and going with it, and knowing, I probably by this point definitely knowing that this was heading for a tragic end, but you just go with it and see where it takes you.
So the next sort of scene that we're going to look at is almost one of the last scenes with Beak, where he has that memory of what happened to his brother, this trauma that's followed him his entire life. So I'll put it up on the screen. So it's chapter 22, and what strikes me is a lot of the images associated with Beak. He keeps talking about the candles, and here we see that he used to make the figures out of leftover candle wax, that this is a point of connection to his childhood, to this past trauma. And it's made explicitly clear here that he had shaped the discarded wax into these figures as toys to play with.
Mm-hmm.
But this scene is so devastating because it's told with such simplicity in a child's voice, a naive, innocent voice that still does not understand what happened. And the death of his older brother by suicide, his older brother killing himself, and Beak having that survivor's guilt, that trauma of not being able to save his brother. But even in this description, Beak frames it as a child would frame it at the time. Beak is a grown man now, but still thinks about it in those childish terms, and still thinks of it as a game his brother was playing with the rope that went wrong. And so much of this, because it is in that stylistic language of a child thinking about the idylls of the endless summer days when they played, and we know of the underlying trauma, we know of the darkness associated with his childhood, it casts us into such sharp relief. And then we see what happens to the brother here, and that, I think, gives it a poignancy. The simple language, the innocence with which Beak remembers it, and all of this is happening as Beak has metaphorically lit all of the candles to protect the bone hunters. And we see that because he couldn't save his brother, that aspect of his family, now we're seeing Beak save his new family, the bone hunters. All of these things tied together, and that's what gives this, I think, such emotional poignancy and impact.
Well, it's interesting because looking and reading over this, which I just did a few minutes ago, I'm reminded of how I was taught to write short stories. And I mean, this is basically a short story, structurally. And I mean, it's out of its time for, we're in the midst of, in Reaper's Gale, a moment of battle. and a moment where, you know, hopefully the reader's interest and excitement is right there on that battlefield, and the readers are with the bone hunters in this very extreme moment. And so I haven't gone back to look, but the sentence structure and sentence patterns, there'll be heavy immediacy to the tone and atmosphere of those sections. And then imagine this scene wasn't here, or imagine it appeared somewhere else. It is basically a past event that is attaching new emotional context to what we're going to see. And so if it wasn't here, I don't think the reader response to Beak would be anywhere near the level. And I know I'm talking about the content of this, but if this wasn't placed exactly where it was in the novel, I don't think the impact would have been the same. I could be wrong there, but I think it's this little miniature short story written in a very naive voice that is giving the context to what he is about to do. And because it's a short story, what I learned with short story writing was you pick a few things and you focus on them and you stay with them and you let them assume new meaning as you proceed through that little vignette, that little short story. And so the wax, all the things that have been led up to on this, we had the imagery of the candle, we had some of the background on, you know, the fact that it was his brother who was subject to the abuse. I think by this point, we've already realized that Beak probably destroyed his home, his estate, and his parents, and probably his tutors and everyone else who was there. He has simply wiped them off the face of the earth. So we already have that, but everything else is simply encapsulated within this short story, which then adds this other level to when we come back to what was happening and on the battlefield, that everything, the context of everything that we've just been reading about up to this point has been fundamentally and irreversibly changed. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Sure. Because the inclusion of this vignette, to draw a parallel to one of an earlier scene that is in some ways slightly similar, it's Covian's sacrifice in Memories of Ice, but that was seen externally. That was seen very much from the outside, and Covian was doing something, and we witnessed it. We see his pain, but we don't feel it because it was almost cinematic in that you're viewing it, whereas here we are internalized. We get into the interiority of Beak, what he is thinking, as we know he is using all of his magic at once. We know he has reached into all of the warrens to try and protect everyone. We know how dangerous this is for mages. And in this moment, he's not thinking necessarily of the situation. He's making an emotional connection that is explaining why he is doing this. And we see it is all tied up. What he feels for the bone hunters, why he wants to protect everyone. This is his reason. And this insertion of the vignette gives that interior perspective that we were missing with Itkovian. And now, instead of just viewing the act of sacrifice, we are experiencing the act of sacrifice. And I think that adds to its depth, that adds to its power. And that is why this scene in particular is so powerful, why so many readers remember it. When what Itkovian does, they all think is, oh, that's a brilliant scene and it's very powerful and it has this context. It seems almost pale in comparison to this scene with Beak?
I guess. I mean, there's the tragedy that sits behind it, but that was, I mean, the start of this in terms of the use of the particular symbols and the candle and the wax figures shows up in the beginning of Gardens of the Moon with Riga. So the precedent is kind of set very early on that this is a metaphor that is real in this in the Malazan world, in the Malazan universe. But he's made it a metaphor all over again for his own survival mechanisms. So there is precedent for what we're seeing here, which I think helps. But at the same time, there's a kind of timelessness. There's sections here where you sense his presence in the present, as opposed to the memories, as he's trying to again piece these things together and try to work out what exactly was going on back then. And so those things are showing up, like there were decisions that did not seem like decisions. I mean, that's not Beak as a child, right? That's Beak in the present.
And in fact, that line there, fire everywhere, fire right through Beak's body.
Yeah.
And again, it's the use of the third person. He's referring to himself in the third person, kind of in this sort of narrative. It gives that both separation from self, and it's this movement joining that moment in the past directly to this moment in the present. That these are the points of connection that are linking the two things together in his mind. So
basically what the reader's doing is making the journey back and forth between the two. And the more that sort of starts to fuse together, then all the emotion, all the tragedy of Beak's remembrance is then brought into the presence. It's brought into this moment, so that when we come back to the hilltop, everything has now changed. So,
and that's, he did not know why he was thinking about his brother now, as he set ablaze every candle within him to make the world bright and to save all his friends. And before long, he no longer sensed anyone else, barring the faint smudges they had become, the captain, the fist, all the soldiers who were his friends. He let his light unfold to embrace them all, to keep them safe from that frightening dark magic so eager to rush down upon them. It had grown too powerful for those 7 mages to contain. They had created something now that would destroy them. But Beak would not let it hurt his friends. And can't read that. And so he made his light burn yet brighter. He made of it a solid thing. Would it be enough? He did not know, but it had to be. For without friends, there was nothing, no one. And the point, Itkovian's sacrifice, because again, when Itkovian sacrifices himself, the burial mound is created. And we see that echoed here with what happens with Beak. But one of the big differences, what Itkovian did was very hard to conceptualize. It was actually quite difficult to imagine and wrap your head around the metaphysical concepts involved. Here we are seeing something that is, because it is reflected in such a simplified, childlike manner, it is so easy to grasp what he is doing, why he is doing it, what the sacrifice is, and what it is costing him. And
I couldn't have done this with Itkovian. It was not. It would not have worked. So for me, the emotional impact of Itkovian's action is found in the rebirth of memories among the Talanomas, and so that's where short stories show up all over again. Really quick characterizations. But someone like Beak, if he got maybe 30 pages out of this novel total, because there are no constraints to his internal monologue, it's quite possible to deliver all you have to deliver in a mere 30 pages. Because there's there's no filters inside, so you can expose it all, and that allows, for a lot more depth to the content, I think.
Yeah,
With
and
other characters, you got to stretch things out. So
well, and also you're not applying the same sort of structure to Beak's narrative that you would apply to the overall narrative of a novel or of a story
yeah,
in general, because it's in that short story frame. And because of that, you can do things with a short story, just like you can do things with poetry that you can't really do with a novel, in which there are certain expectations for how things flow, for how things move. Otherwise, readers get very, very frustrated. And these being dropped in as vignettes, these being dropped in as small moments into a larger narrative, allow them to stand apart, allow them to gain significance and special resonance that you wouldn't have if it was just the entire thing all in one go.
yeah. I think the to start within a flashback and then melt it into the present also matches sort of what is going on there. But structurally, it's quite unusual. It's kind of timeless in a way. It's both in that deep past, which is where Beak is trapped. I mean, he's been trapped there all his life. He's 36 years old. He's still trapped in that barn. So that sense of bringing all of that to this one moment of burning all of the candles completes his story in a sense. But then it struck me at that point that no, it's not complete. So I think we're going to have to go to the next section.
Yeah, but the scene I want to talk about here is obviously Beak's afterlife, the death, his meeting of Hood and what happens to him, because again, this is the conclusion of it, and it's not just his sacrifice, it's not just the emotional response of Fered and Sort and the other soldiers, it's not just all of those things, it's not just the burial mound. Now we get again this interiority, this inside look into his soul as it transitions, and I think that is a very powerful moment, and it sets it again apart from Itkovian, who is a comparable analog. Do you want to read this one this time?
I can try. I might get emotional. We'll see. One of the things that this, of course, foreshadows is all of this which the reader is witnessing is not witnessed by the fellow soldiers. So this is unwitnessed for all of the characters within this world, with the exception of the players involved, obviously. So in that sense, it is foreshadowing some aspects of things. But anyways, another helping hand lifting Beak to his feet. He looked round, nothing much to see. White sand, a gate of white marble ahead, within which swirled silver light. The hand gripping his arm was skeletal, the skin a strange hue of green. The figure, very tall, was hooded and wearing black rags. It seemed to be studying the gate. Is that where I'm supposed to go now? Beak asked. Yes. All right. Are you coming with me? No. All right. Well, will you let go of my arm then? The hand fell away. It is not common, the figure then said. What? That I attend to arrivals in person. My name is Beak. Yes. What's through there? Your brother waits for you, Beak. He has been waiting a long time. Beak smiled and stepped forward, all at once in a great hurry. The silver light within that gate was beautiful, reminding him of something. The stranger's voice brought him round. Beak. Yes, your brother, he will not know you yet. Do you understand? Beak nodded. Why aren't you coming with me? I choose to wait for another. My brother, Beak said, his smile broadening. I'm taller now, stronger. I can save him, can't I? A long pause, and then the figure said, yes, Beak, you can save him. Yes, that made sense. He set out again, with sure strides, to the gate, into that silver glow, to emerge on the other side in a glade beside a trickling stream, and kneeling near the bank, his brother. The same as he remembered, On the ground on all sides, there were hundreds of small wax figures, smiling faces, an entire village, maybe even a whole town. Beak walked up to his brother, who said, too shy to look up, I made all of these for him. They're beautiful, Beak said, and he found tears running down his face, which embarrassed him, so he wiped them away, then asked, can I play with you? His brother hesitated, scanning all the figures. Then he nodded, all right. And so Beak knelt down beside his brother, while upon the other side of the gate, the god Hood stood motionless, waiting. Yeah, that's a rough one. But, you know, it's, I guess I felt that if I dragged the readers through everything that we had just seen with Beak, that the world itself needed to answer it if no one else could. So,
yeah, and it is actually like an incredibly emotional passage, because that the depth of the trauma, the innocence, and this is something that you know, is a repeated theme in the books of the toll that war and life takes on innocence, that takes on children. And Beak has remained, as you said, like trapped in that moment, trapped as a child, even though his adult body is there. And this moment, his reward for his sacrifice is to get his greatest wish, to be reunited with his loved ones. And it places death in the realm of Malazan in a very different light.
Yes. The first instance, I think, where I'm foreshadowing, you know, the other side of Hood. Yeah.
Because obviously, like the first time we encountered Hood's Gate was in Gardens of the Moon, and it certainly did not appear that way.
No, the gate's completely different, isn't it?
When Ganos appears in front of Hood's Gate, it's frightening and gothic and full of skeletals, and there's a sense of pain and dis and hell and all those aspects, the city of the dead. Whereas here, this is a sense of beauty and paradise and peace. And it shows the complexity of what different visions of the afterlife can be, but also the reward for this good life, this pure life. And I don't think it's as didactic as that. I don't think it's a message that way, quite that way. But those are connotations associated, I think.
Yeah, I think it's what the character brings from their past or from their lives in terms of how they visualize subconsciously their arrival, you know, at the gates, whatever the gates are. And of course, the silver light is the echo of, you know, him burning all of his candles and the whiteness that comes from the blending of all the colors.
But even then, his responses to Hood, what makes the scene even more emotional is the humor in it of, are you going to come with me? No. Well, can you let go of my arm then? And it's that innocent, not the Beak does not understand in the same way that the reader does what is happening here and the import of what is happening here, because that's not who he is. And that humor, the tragedy and the comedy together give it that sense of catharsis, that emotional outlet, that needing to laugh to release the pain.
Yeah.
And the final image then of the brother obviously being the same age as when he died, but all this time has passed, so he has been waiting for Beak and has made Beak the toys, the wax villagers that Beak had played with, and he's waiting for Beak, and he's going, I've made him all of these toys. That is again this heart-wrenching innocence.
Well, it's his brother trapped in his time as well, right? So, you know, for the brother, Beak is still his little brother, whatever name, you know, he may have at that point.
And we have that additional meaning to the number of wax figures that he has created show the passage of time, how long the brother has
Yeah.
been dead, has been trapped as this spirit in this one moment. But also it went from the couple of little figures in Beak's life to now we think of the Bone Hunter army, all of these friends, all of these villagers looking at him smiling. These are being evoked through all of the wax figures that are now surrounding both of them with love and support that they never had as
Yeah.
children.
And it's a weird thing, but I suspect it was in the back of my mind. But a lot of this world's religions seem to view suicide as the greatest sin of all, the greatest crime of all. And I'm not going to go much in that direction, except to say that in my mind, I definitely wanted to convey compassion to the person who commits suicide. So in other words, the reward is not just Beak's, it's his brothers as well.
Yeah, and the fact that they are both reunited, I think, is important. It is clear that the brother loved Beak, and it's you never name the brother.
No.
Which is one of these wonderful things that gives it that abstraction, that generalization, that it's not a specific character, it's anyone's brother. And again, that brings it home in a way that if it was a character specific instance, maybe shortens it or narrows the focus a little.
Yeah.
So there's a universality to it. This remains one of the narrative threads in the Malazan Book of the Fallen that was enormously impactful when I read it the first time, and remained just as impactful, if not more so, the second time that I read it. It speaks to me emotionally on a level that the only sort of comparator was actually in Deadhouse Gates, and a lot of the emotions running through that there are these moments within the books that transcend the fact that our expectations about what epic fantasy is or is meant to do, that there are these moments that are just beautiful, and this is one of them.
Well, it's great. A lot of it is, in a sense, thematically setting up the book you're about to read, right? Toll the Hounds. And certainly the role of Hood is definitely set up. And some of the structural things I do there, because you're going to get short stories again, sort of tucked into the novel. And I guess, I don't know, I guess it's unusual. I don't know if I can really think of examples similar within the genre.
Neil Gaiman's American Gods uses inserted vignettes to illustrate certain things, to break up the chapter narratives. But it's not common in fantasy writing to do this, but also it's not absolutely unique and uncommon.
No, actually, now I think about it, one of the first ones that caught me was in Donaldson's second trilogy of Thomas Covenant, with the character of Lyndon Avery, and there's a flashback to her father, which is just devastating, absolutely devastating. And it's those kind of things that kick open doors and open windows on possibilities. And so when later on you're writing towards some kind of scene like that, you want to sort of invoke that kind of special feeling to these things. Beak was an unusual little exercise to cram as much in there as I could in those few scenes where we get him. And I think the writer always wants to challenge oneself in the process of writing, and there was something about Beak that just sort of made all the emotions raw, completely raw, because yeah, there's nothing subtle. There's subtle stuff going on, but in his mind, there is nothing subtle here. It just is. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for discussing this this particular aspect. This is a very difficult book. I would love to like spend all of that time doing close readings of every single section, but obviously that 30 odd pages, that's several hours worth of discussion.
Easily. Yeah.
And that's just going through it on that without talking about the analysis outside of it.
Mm.
But Beak remains a fan favorite and a favorite of mine because the emotion is so powerful and uncomplicated. That the emotion is uncomplicated. There are very clever things that you do with the writing, but like you said, it's Beak as a character himself is so forthright
Yeah.
and so easy to grasp and so guileless. And it's that loss of innocence tied into all of these other things that I think is so touching and reaches out to that part of us that always wants to protect children, that always wants to protect innocence, that always want us to protect those less powerful than ourselves.
Going so far as to actually force Hood into making an appearance in this case. Yeah.
So, Steve, thank you very much.
Yeah. Fun.
And for those of you still watching, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.